voices, please. Thank you. Hi, and welcome to Harriman State Park, the Railroad Ranch, Heritage Days, and our oral history presentation of ranching in the Island Park area. I'm John Sullivan, Park Manager of Harriman State Park. So welcome. This is going to be, I hope, what everybody believes, as I believe, and Jocelyn and Tim, just an awesome addition to what we've been doing here at Heritage Days, and their brainchild, and we as the park and IDPR are like super excited to be part of it. I think it's going to be interesting, I think it's going to be informative, and hopefully you're going to learn some things that you didn't know about, because what do we have, like 1,000 years worth of history here that hopefully we can pass on to you. I'll make one introduction and then I'll leave the rest to Jocelyn for her crew. I'll introduce our Deputy Director, Keith Hobbs. Drove all the way out here this morning from Boise to be part of that and keep everything on track and keep things rolling. He's the perfect person to do that. So without further ado, I'll introduce Jocelyn Matkins, who's the Executive Director of the Teton Regional Land Trust.
Hi everybody, I am just wanting to welcome you on behalf of the Land Trust to this really special opportunity to tell some great stories. I know Tim Reynolds and our Development Director Diane Temple, along with John and folks, have been working on this for a couple of years to get it together, to get the right people in the room, and we're just really excited to hear these great stories today. And the Land Trust really works to help maintain farm and ranch heritage in eastern Idaho. We've protected about 34,000 acres with about 120 families, and so it's just a real honor for us to get to hear your stories and learn more about your family history and everything you bring to this area. Anything else, Tim? All right, we're going to pass it over to Keith, and he is going to moderate this tonight and introduce the speakers as we go.
Thanks. Welcome to Harriman. Thank you, Tim, for the invitation and the opportunity to do this. My name is Keith Hobbs. I spent a considerable amount of time in Island Park, specifically at this park, as a manager prior to John's arrival. So I got to spend about 13 years dealing with many of the grazers who made use of the railroad ranch. And during that process, I became a lot more familiar and became a lot more invested into that connection these gentlemen and these women brought that predated my arrival and the arrival of this park and the arrival of most people in Island Park. And so I'm just thrilled to have an opportunity to hear a little bit more about that story. Unfortunately now, I'm no longer here, I'm in Boise, but I do get to come over and have some fun here. The format today is going to be somewhat of an unstructured, structured format. If you want to put it that way, we're going to move down this direction and ask people to give a little discussion of their family history, maybe some of their experiences that they had in Island Park, and some of those stories that make their experience unique. And obviously those are the things that we want to hear about today. My role is to be a moderator, a facilitator, to try to move this along so that we stay within our time format, our time frame, and allow for some more open discussion at the end. But to begin, we'd like for each representative to have a brief discussion. We're looking at somewhere around 8 or 9 minutes, and give us a little background and a little bit about the impact of your family and this area have had on each other. Because your family has affected this area, and this family has affected you, and this area has affected your family. And that's really what we want to hear about, that connection that you have with this landscape and the history you bring. So we'll go ahead and start off. Unfortunately, I don't know most of you. I know a couple of you, but most of the grazers that were on the park are not here right now. And they don't have that long history in the Island Park. They kind of came in and were grazing on the park, and then were in DuBois or Idaho Falls, down in Raritan. They weren't settled so much on this ground, so it's very nice to see you guys here and have that. So we're going to start off first, pardon my glasses, and Tim, could you point out the Flying W Bar Ranch? And that's going to be where we're going to take off to first and hear a little bit from Scott. I'm assuming you're Scott.
I am.
And we'll turn it over to you. Thank you
All
so
about
much.
things that people know us best.
Please
I'm going to
take it away.
stand if you don't mind, because as what I do for a living, I typically stand when I'm talking to people, just to make sure these guys can hear. Before I get started, I just want to make sure that you guys understand how hard Tim Reynolds has worked. He's worked with us, not only with Teton Land Trust, we've had conversations with him for about 10 years, but we do a flower walk on our property that Tim puts together every year, and I know he has worked tirelessly to put this event together along with Harriman Park, so I think we should all give Tim a round of applause. As Mr. Hobbs said, my name is Scott. I'm representing the Flying W Bar Ranch here in Island Park. I believe Tim just pointed it out on the ranch, or on the map, the ranch out on the map, I should say. We have an interesting history. In 1880, actually 1879, a guy named A.S. Trude, who was a very prominent and successful defense attorney from Chicago, came out on a hunting trip to Island Park with a buddy of his, and absolutely, like all of us, fell in love with the beauty of the area. He came back the next year in 1880 and bought, at the time, the Bellevue Hotel. And the Bellevue Hotel was privately held, I believe. This is a little bit of the history, it's a little gray, and I was told that Michael Stanley, who was involved with the Algenia Cattle and Land Company and the Bellevue Hotel, might be able to fill in some gaps. But A.S. Trude bought what was the Bellevue Hotel, which is a beautiful 3-story building on 40 acres of land on the east side of the Snake River, almost identically to where the Lakeside Lodge currently sits. He bought that for $5,000. Kind of sounds funny now, right? But that was a lot of money back then in 1880. So he came out from Chicago every year after he acquired that hotel and amassed, through means of homesteading and buying up surrounding private property, amassed a total of 5,000 acres. Okay? Now, just prior to him coming out, that particular property, the Bellevue Hotel and some of the acreage around it, was actually the Orangi, we believe it's pronounced Orangi Land and Cattle Company. They were a Swiss family, from what we hear. They came out to develop cheese and to use cattle and goats to do that. In theory, that might be okay. But for those of us who know Island Park winters, we know that the cattle and goats don't do too well in December or January. So that business failed pretty quickly. Just prior to their acquisition of that same property was in fact the Bellevue Hotel, which ran for, we think, about 5 years, which means it was built somewhere in the area of 1870. And it, unfortunately, it went out of business when the railroad went in, when the Yellowstone leg of the railroad went in. The horse carriages, it was a stage stop, but those horse carriages stopped coming once the railroad went in, so it took away a lot of business. Then it went to that Land and Cattle Company for cheese making, then A.S. Trude bought it in 1880. Now, as I said, A.S. Trude had 5 descendants, and he amassed 5,000 acres in total. So when A.S. passed, each of his children, all 5 of them, got a 1,000 acre parcel. Our ranch, the Flying W, and the Trude Ranch, that's now owned and operated by Judy Wright, are the only 2 remaining operating segments of that original 5,000. The other 3, unfortunately, have dissolved through time, been sold, marriages, divorces, bloodlines get dissolved, and unfortunately they're gone. So that's what's so important about the heritage and keeping lineage and keeping history and photographs and archives, because these stories disappear, and it's a sad thing. All right? So we are apparently, since I'm first in line, I've been told by Tim, we're the oldest, longest family-held operation as far as a ranch in Island Park, so we're pretty proud of that. And we're doing our best to be good stewards of the land. It's not easy, times are changing. People think, oh, you got 1,000 acres, you got a lot of money. Not the case. So we're doing what we can to keep this thing together, for sure. We're working hard, and Tim is helping us guide us with some options of that as well. So after the 5 descendants of A.S. Trude all got their 1,000 acre packages or parcels, here we are, I'm 5th generation. My grandfather Hal Wilkins was 3rd generation. My father Bob Wilkins, who just passed away last July, unfortunately, he was 4th generation, and I am now at the helm with 4 other family members. There's 5 in my generation that are in control. I'm kind of the only guy who knows what's going on, but that's why I'm here. But we're working as a team. The interesting interesting thing about our particular piece of property that I think a lot of people find fascinating is, remember, our building and our structures go back to that old Bellevue Hotel, built in roughly 1870. That hotel is not our ranch house, although there's a pretty common misnomer that it is actually the old hotel, so it's now our ranch house. It is not. Our ranch house was a support building to the Bellevue Hotel, whether it was housekeeping quarters, whether it was a storeroom, we're not 100% sure, but it was a support outbuilding to the actual hotel itself. In 1934, the Department of Interiors came in and said, we're going to dam up the Snake River, and we're going to back up a big reservoir for potato farming irrigation. They gave everybody 2 years who were within the floodplain to get anything out of the floodplain that stood more than 36 inches tall. Well, Bellevue Hotel stood a good 30, 35 feet, so out of the question, right? So our ranch house, being one of those support buildings to the hotel, was literally dragged across from the east side of the Snake River, where Lakeside Lodge is, across the Snake River with aids of pontoons and cabling and rails and old trucks and even a steam-driven tractor. They got this old house without breaking one window across the Snake River, dragged it up on the eastern side of our property, which if you're at the Lakeside Lodge having a hamburger out on the deck, and you look directly west, right across the Snake River, you're looking at our eastern pasture there, our barn, the old garages. You might see a couple of horses there. So our building came across the Snake River right up onto where we watch the fireworks every 4th of July, and went about another half to 3/4 of a mile to the west, and ended up out on a nice lava rock outcropping right over where Hotel Creek joins Island Park Reservoir. So quite a feat to drag a house 3/4 of a mile without breaking a window, right? So once that house was positioned there, a nice exterior glass porch and an additional second story were kind of added to the house. That was in 36. That was the most recent remodel to that house. The interesting thing about the house, it is currently loaded with all the furnishings and the trim work and the glass and the windows, all the stuff in that house. It's like a museum. Came out of the hotel itself. Because once they moved that outbuilding, some got a bunch of guys got together and drew straws to see who got to burn down the Bellevue Hotel. Man, I couldn't do it. Somebody got, in my opinion, a short straw on that one. For me, that'd be a tough thing to do. But it had to be done from the Department of Interior's requirements. So just before that happened, good old A.S. Trude stripped out, again, the furnishings, the molding, the staircase, the fireplace, all kinds of stuff. And our ranch house looks very much like a hotel. There are even room numbers on the original doors. So, and it's true, and it's just a museum. It really is. But people confuse that with the fact that it's not actually the hotel, it's a support building to it. So it's a fascinating property. I do host a flower walk generally immediately after the 4th of July every year. That's one of my dad's ways of getting the word out and sharing the property, and I'm carrying that on in memorandum. So for those of you who have not seen the property, if you're interested at any point next year, right after the 4th of July, we'll have a flower walk. I'm sure you get in touch with Tim. He heads that up. And this last time was a record, 40-something people. It's the biggest one we had. So it's a good way to learn the property. I always take a little extra few minutes and give you a little tour through the living room and stuff of the old big house. So it's a very interesting property. And then if I still got a minute or two, or you hacking me off?
I'm about to, but give me a minute.
All right. To answer his statement of what impact we had on the area or the area had on us, I would say for me personally, it's absolutely the impact that the area has on us. We are simply trying to be good stewards. We're trying to keep a piece of history intact, which is not easy these days. We're all busy. We're all living out of state, but we're doing our best to keep it together. But the biggest impact of all, regardless of which direction that goes in, I think is the impact of the feeling of family and unity and heritage and history and good neighbors. And you can, I just did a construction project on a handshake. I just built a bridge, and all my suppliers on the property, it was a handshake deal. No credit card, get no deposits. I mean, those are the good old days. And we still have a little flavor of those good old days, and that's what makes this place so special. So. All right, that's my piece.
Thank you. That was excellent.
Oh, you're good.
Let me introduce the next speaker is actually a gal that I worked with quite a bit when I was here. She worked for the Forest Service, and we got to spend quite a bit of time together assembling Mesa Falls. And it was always a pleasure to work with Kay. Kay Orm, would you select the branch property that we will be speaking of? And Kay, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. In 1875, John Cooch was 14 years old, traveling through the area on the Oregon Trail on his way to Oregon with family. As he came to Idaho, he just absolutely loved it, wanted to come back. And so he returned in 1883 with 5 teams of horses that the railroad hired out. And so he was on the survey crew, all the survey crew along from Spencer, Idaho, through Shotgun Valley, and on to Yellowstone surveying the railroad. He married my grandmother in 1886. They had 7 children. And it's kind of comical, in a 1949 interview, someone says, why didn't you leave Idaho? Why did you leave Oregon? And he said, because I had seen this country once, and I never forgot it. I've seen a lot of country, traveled a lot, but I've never seen country like this. It's the finest and the best, and even then, I knew it. And then with a little twinkle in his eye, he said, and we had so many kids, we couldn't afford to move. So he pioneered the tourist trade in Island Park. He owned and operated, we're gonna need to have a conversation, the Arangi Hotel.
Oh, nice.
And it was known as the John Cooch Hostelry, and it was sold in 1890. The deed we have is 1892 Gerber. So we'll have to visit about that a little bit. Then he,
Might not be talking about the same property, I don't think so.
I think it is the same property because the records I have is that Trude ended up with the property.
Okay, interesting.
So, then he went to the North Fork Club, which is on the north side of the river in Maxim. He was there until 1904, and he ran the Cooch Resort. And then in 1912, he built a lodge over at Big Springs, and it was called Jack's Big Springs Inn. And he ran that from 1912 through 1929 under a lease with the Forest Service. And in the meantime, he homesteaded the present ranch. He and his children, all 7 children were born around the North Fork Club. They settled there and ended up with about 1,270 acres, and it's still in the family today, that piece. Interesting thing is in order to buy groceries and support themselves those days, they would ice fish off of Henry's Lake. They could sell the fish for $6 a pound. So they'd pack the boxes up in 100-pound boxes, haul them to Oneida, and they'd sell it, put it on the train and sell it. And that's how they basically got their families and supported themselves a little bit. They ran sheep and cattle, and also had this company called Yellowstone Lettuce. So out on the flats, they had lettuce for a while, and that's kind of when they started irrigating. And if you look out there the right time of year, you can still see the old rows and some of the ditches and things that went with the lettuce. After he had ranched for a while and looked at it, he thought this is really only able to support 2 families, and I have 7 kids. So the 2 oldest boys, Bill and Calvin, ended up with the sheep and cattle operations. And he had another son, John, who started working for the Forest Service and actually was a forest supervisor on the Harriman State Park we're on now. In 1915, they had cattle up here. And in 1915, they ran out of hay. And so they got about 8 or 10 friends together, and they shoveled a path from the ranch down the road, up the Big Springs Road, and over to Big Springs Trestle, and put 150 head of cattle in the river for a couple of months. And they survived on the dead grasses, the snow melted along the river, and the moss and the watercress and things in the river. And they were quite proud of themselves because they didn't lose any cattle, but one day the cattle were bed down on the train track in a nice warm sun and they came in the train. And there were 7 of them gone. And they felt like that was pretty good odds considering what they had done and went through. My grandmother before she was married to my father, or my grandfather, this is an interesting connection too that we'll need to talk about, is she worked for the Trudes, and so she went back to Chicago and was a nanny for Trudes, and then she took her sister and went back too. So because she was in this area working for Trudes, she met my grandfather, Calvin, who, he and his brother were operating the ranch, and they were married in 1931. Had 4 children, 3 did not survive, so that left my mom. And in the meantime, a few years later, my Uncle Bill had a stroke and was unable to really carry on his ranching duties, so my grandfather bought him out. And so then he was responsible for all the operations. He passed away in 1954, leaving it to my mom and my grandma. They leased it out to the Crystal family. The Crystals aren't around here, but I'm sure most people have heard of the Crystals in the area. For a few years, and then my dad, Rich Orm, married my mom in 1957. And he came from a ranching and farming family, and so it was a pretty good fit in that he was feeding cows and calves all winter in Eaton, Idaho, at a feedlot, and then they would trail them out to near DuBois, Idaho, Camas Creek area, and stay for the summer. And then when he and my mom got married, they would trail them up here for, to finish them up on this nice grass before they send them away. And so they trailed cattle probably in the early 1970s or so, and then it just got to be where cattle trucks were more efficient and it was just a little bit better operation. So from Camas Creek, we brought them up on trucks. It's been a pretty dang good life living on a ranch all your life. You remember things, and that was way before the let-down fence. Everybody put every staple and everything, and there's about 9 miles of fence, and he's got 3 girls and a boy, and the boy's the youngest, and so all of us, at age 8, it was like your beauty queen crown. You got that hammer, and as you got older, the hammer weighed more. And you could do it. And when, of course, when those let-down fences came, it was like, thank you. That was a pretty good deal. My brother Brad was killed in 2005, and so the ranching responsibilities or the land was left to myself and my 2 sisters. And so we have been still operating the ranch. We maintain the fences and the irrigation, and we lease it to Burtonshaw's. So we still have cattle on the ranch, and it's our 5th generation, and on the same piece of property. I do want to take just a minute, if I can. Our neighbors to the east are the Angets, and I think everybody's heard of Meadow Creek Lodge or Bill Anget. And they came shortly after my grandfather came to the country, and they were just, on the next property, and so both families became very good friends and did quite a bit of things together, and I feel like we'd be remiss in this conversation if we didn't mention them.
Good point.
And the interesting thing is when Peter Anget came from Norway, and he brought milk cows with him, and he had, I think, 17 head of milk cows when he came, and so when they came, they lived in tents, and as they built the barns. So the barns and all the facilities for the animals came first because that was how they made their money, was milk. And so they lived in tents for a couple of winters until the house was built. And then when the house was built, the tents were used as schoolhouse for the kids in the area, and so that's where most of the young kids went to school, were over acres in the tents. Then Peter Anget's son was old. We always refer to him as Old Bill, and they've always ran sheep and a little bit of cattle. They had a lot of Forest Service allotments that they ran sheep on, and then they bring them down to their place. Old Bill had a heart attack and was able to keep ranching, so his son Bill Anget, who is still alive now, took the operations over when he was 18 in high school. So he's done it quite a while. And now their nephew Hal is running cattle and kind of taking care of the ranch. So I think Hal is their 4th generation. I'm 4th generation, and then my sister's children and the siblings of Howard or another fifth generation. So it's, yeah, it's been a great life. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Kay. Thank you so much for that. Tim, could you point out McCray and Blue Lake Ranch? And today to speak to those.
Located in this general area, those ranches no longer exist as complete entities.
And to speak to that, we have John Keith III. So if you turn it over to him, we'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
After listening to the first two speakers, I think I'm going to feel last night was kind of boring. Poor Tim here's probably going, oh no. My first trip to Island Park was in 1935 as a baby. Now, I know you are trying to calculate my age, so I'll just tell you I'm 83. I also come from the Trude line, but my great-grandfather was Charles Trude, who was A.S.'s brother along with the rest of the Trudes. Charles Trude came out from Chicago to manage A.S. Trude's property so that he could go back and be an attorney. One of his sons was named Sam Trude, and Sam Trude became one of the first managers of this ranch, the railroad ranch, for a while in the early 1900s. And he was also a teacher and a judge, and he finally bought Elk Creek Ranch, and he lost it in a poker game. The luck of our family. His sister, Sally Algenia McCray, Trude, Sally Algenia Trude, and I'm going to call her Mom McCray because she married Billy McCray, another playboy from Chicago, and she homesteaded with Billy in 1907 on the Snake River, about a mile below. It's at the McCray Bridge, which is the crossing of the Yale-Kilgore Road and of the Snake River. Early in those years, there were actually Indian hunting parties, and they would stop by the ranch, which at that time was pretty isolated, and they'd be hungry, and if they hadn't had a good kill, and they would beg for corn and flour. And so the Indian population was still very sparse, but was still evident in Island Park. Billy McCray, being kind of adventurous, decided that if he could raise and breed harness horses, trotters and pacers, and have them up in the high elevations of Island Park and take them down to Arizona or to Salt Lake, he would win a lot of races. Unbeknownst to him, he needed a better bloodline like Dan Patch or someone that was more evident in the winner circle. And so that was unsuccessful. After about 20 years of that marriage, he passed away unexpectedly, and the ranch was converted over to a dude ranch and eventually cattle when they bought the Blue Lake Ranch. Everyone, or a lot of people in Island Park, except Trude Ranch, had either a lot of guests or dudes from out of state. And so it became a money-making thing for the McCrays. because they were on the Snake River for the fishing availability and had boats. They had the wildlife and the bird hunting. They formed up pack trips up into the mountains. They had cookouts around the campfire outside the main cabin, and horseback rides, of course, for the dudes. I'm going to turn the clock back a little bit to the late 1930s and early 1940s. We had no electricity. And as a result, our water source was the Snake River. And I remember as a child going down there with a little berry bucket, berry pail, with my mother and her sisters and fetching water, and we'd return it to the chamber that was adjacent to the fire part of our wood-burning stove, which we did all our cooking and baking on. And so we, you gotta say, well, how did you bathe? Oh, that was a real trick. You took a large pan, about this big around, that you could stand in, and you get pitchers of warm or hot water, and you get one of these deals. You're in the middle of the room, hopefully your own bedroom, and you'd splash yourself, soap up, and then grab the pitcher and shower off. And then the other thing is no water, no toilets. So we had outhouses about 50 yards away in the forest, or at the edge of the forest. And at night, when you don't want to go out, we have chamber pots that were by the side of the bed. So those were our problems and hardships. In the late 30s, we didn't have telephone. We had what we call the open line telephone, 2 longs and a short. And the minute the phone would go off, half the eavesdroppers would get and they say, hey Mabel, we're on a private line now. They'd say no. So there were not the conveniences of our little cell phone. The barn was for the riding horses, the dairy cattle, the chickens, where we provided our eggs, and the dairy cattle was the milk, and we made our own butter with churns. That's why I'm so strong in my right arm. And the vegetable gardens gave us enough vegetables. We needed hay to feed those animals, so we acquired the William Trude Ranch, which was showed to you as Blue Lake Ranch, which is now Eagle Ridge. If you know that property, they have a big lake out there, and it's another gorgeous Island Park property. And we would put up hay all summer, and then we didn't have Caterpillar tractors or any of the modern conveniences. We'd hitch up a couple of horses and a mowing machine or a scythe type machine, and cut it, let it dry, go back out a few weeks later and pitch it by hand into the hay wagon. And we drive that back to the barn, which is about 5-6 miles away. And then the barn had the tack room on one side and the animals on the other. And we pitched the hay up into a loft up above. And as we needed the hay, we'd throw it down into the troughs down below for the animals to eat. I wasn't going to tell this story, but I think I will anyway, because This looks like an adult crowd. Apparently I was conceived in that to take care of all our eggs and lettuce and potatoes and things we had to build a root cellar. So you build a room down below grade and put rock walls on it, not very reinforced, but we didn't have ready-mix at the time. And then a staircase down and a little shed type thing over. And you could put potatoes, lettuce, lemons, eggs down in that root cellar. And it had a dirt floor. For an ice box, we did have that in the main cabin, but we'd have to go out in the winter to Blue Lake and saw ice blocks and put them on the horse-drawn carriages again, or wagons, and bring them back to the ranch, find an empty stall, find an empty chicken coop, and pile these blocks of ice in there, and then broadcast sawdust all over it, about that thick, for the insulation. Now, I mentioned this was a dude ranch, and we didn't have ice makers, so when we would serve a cocktail to the dudes, we'd have to chip off from that brick of ice. And even though it was scotch and soda or vodka tonic, it had sawdust floating. So, let me see if I'm dry pouring the tears out of you. The other ranch I wanted to mention, just from a celebrity basis, was the Ellicott Ranch, which was over in the Henry's Lake Flats, but down, it was against Henry's Lake, and it came up to the rodeo grounds. Yeah, the Ellicott Ranch. And that was right next to the Diamond D that Salisbury had, but Tim couldn't get the Diamond D people to come over, but they had a beautiful ranch too. But anyway, the celebrity situation, that was a dude and cattle ranch.